And thank you very much to the Foundation and the Chamber for the invitation to speak today. I think my role is really around, let me just check if this is working. Yes, my role is really sort of take us back a step and put what's going on in China at the moment from the experience that many of you are seeing it from a business level into a sort of a broader complex, a broader picture, looking at what's going on both domestically in terms of the economy and in terms of the politics, but also in terms of what's going on internationally. And of course, the last year has been particularly fraught on that side with the US-China trade war, really unsettling a lot of previous predictions about what was going on in the country. So what I want to do today is, first of all, take a quick look at what's going on domestically with the economy, with politics and so on, give a quick snapshot of what we're looking at internationally and what we're seeing and how that is going to influence what's going on within China and within the New Zealand-China relationship. And then also to kind of look at a few key sectors for New Zealand going forwards. I think first of all, on the economic side, the thing that I would stress is that we've had a real sort of whiplash effect in terms of what's going on in the Chinese economy recently. And it almost feels like we're now on 6 monthly economic cycles, which is something that for people who are used to other markets can be very difficult to adjust to. But within China, you're now really alternating between these sort of 6 monthly periods where stimulus is off and then 6 monthly periods where it's trying to be withdrawn. At the moment, we're still experiencing the upturn that's the result of policy loosening that was going on really in the second half of 2018. That's seen a bit of a recovery in sentiment. We've of course seen the markets pop back up in the first quarter, and indeed confidence levels are much higher than they were at the start of the year. And that's a sign of sort of the stimulus beginning to take effect. It's really being driven by government spending on infrastructure and a bit of a recovery in the housing market, although that latter is nothing like the booms that we used to have in the old days in China. But what I would say is that even though we are seeing a bit of a recovery in sentiment, even though there are some signs that things like private investment and retail spending, consumer sentiment are coming up a little bit, the underlying story is still pretty negative on those fronts. We do think that going forward you are going to see private investment and consumer spending slowing to much slower growth rates than they used to have in the recent past. Moreover, it's important to remember that even though stimulus has kind of lifted things a little bit, the expectation that the government's going to give a credit blowout is very much misplaced. The stimulus effect this time is not going to be particularly big. The People's Bank, the government, are very much aware that this underlying problem is really what's going on in the credit market, trying to deflate that credit bubble and the very high levels of debt that we see in China at the moment. And that is really acting as a constraint on growth prospects going forward. So if you kind of think about things over the next year, over the next 6 months, we are probably going to continue seeing this upswing for at least another 6 months. And then by the time we get to late 2019, you'll see that effect from the stimulus wearing off and things will begin to slow again. So a slightly sort of conservative outlook and things are likely to get even tougher after 2021 when the government hits its growth target. But I would say that China will remain by some way the world's fastest growing major economy, and we don't really see any signs as yet of a hard landing in the economy. So upbeat signs as well as some caution there. Domestically, it remains very important to know what the government is prioritizing and what the government's key goals are. I think we are increasingly looking at a government that is focused around Xi Jinping and his agenda, so it's important to know what the priorities are within the many policy goals that the government is promoting. Still very much top of the list is improving the effectiveness of the CCP. That's improving its moral fiber on the one hand with things like the anti-corruption campaign, but also improving its ability to actually implement policy. And I think what's notable is that the government is still talking about improving the effectiveness of policy implementation, following the party line from the center, even almost 5 years now after Xi Jinping came to power. So this is a long-term goal. It's not reached its goal yet. Secondly, you've got the economic goals, things like poverty reduction and the target of doubling real GDP by 2020. These are very much key targets for the government on the economic side. Together with those, you have the goal of moving China up the value chain. I put Made in China 2025 here. They're not using that phrase anymore, partly because it's become toxic with the US strategic standoff. But the goal is very much still there and very much embodied in a lot of the local government plans that we're still seeing. Secondly, there's this concern around the risk of domestic political instability, and when I talk domestic political instability, I'm talking really about issues like unemployment, environment, and things like the divides within China, the growing rich-poor divide that threatens to create sources of instability. And finally, of course, he's concerned about the factions within the CCP that he needs to constantly balance off against. And within those, I think we've seen evidence in the last few months that the government is becoming a little bit more flexible on economic liberalization again, a goal that really wasn't evident in recent years. But as the US strains have built, there has been more pushback, more people speaking vocally within China, advocating for economic liberalization, and we've seen signs that that is getting some traction. So there is a little bit of policy flexibility as the government seeks to balance these factions within the party. In terms of the key policies, I think some of the key things that we need to be watching on going forwards, first of all, is this distinction between public and private. And one of the international things that's developed that is really the confrontation over Huawei and the way that the government's responded to actions against Huawei. Nominally a private firm, but being championed and defended by China in a way that really sort of suggests it's strategic and nationally important in a way that is usually favored for the state sector. But I'm not just talking about things like Huawei, where you're talking about strategically important companies. We're also seeing a lot of shift as part of the government's mixed ownership reform. One of the things that the foreign press tends to focus on is how that allows private firms to take stakes in public sector firms. That's all very well and good, but actually the more interesting side to me is the fact that it's also allowing state firms to take stakes in private sector firms. In the dairy sector, for example, we've seen the government taking stakes in firms like Beingmate, Beingmei, or Osnutria Dairy, Aoyo Naiye, and Noritz. So these firms are sort of getting public stakes in their own businesses, and the reason why they're doing that is because if you get access to state capital, then it's more easy to access state resources, it's more easy to access favorable government policies. You build these relationships with government that are helpful for doing your own business. That all sort of sums up together to a situation where if you're a foreign government and you're talking about sort of national interest issues and you're creating a special set of rules for state-owned enterprises who want to invest in your country, you're really dealing with a sort of a model that doesn't really apply to China, where the boundary between state and private is much more hazy. In terms of reform, we are actually seeing significant moves on liberalization and on areas that foreign businesses have championed for a long time, like IP protection. The foreign investment law should step up IP protection by, for example, prohibiting leakages during administrative reviews. You've also seen improvements under things like the anti-unfair competition law that touches on these sorts of areas. But fundamentally, foreign businesses are still suffering from a bit of promise fatigue on this side, and people still very much waiting to see evidence before they actually change their minds. Data security is going to be an increasingly problematic area. And really, when we're talking about that, we're talking about cross-border flows of data and technology, which are becoming increasingly difficult. If we look at the government statements on this, we see that these issues are very much seen as part of the national security framework, and that seems unlikely to change. The overall policy is very much around strengthening controls and moving towards self-reliance. That obviously is going to be a huge challenge in a world where we are seeing data become a much more important part of firms even outside technology-related spheres, and could have a lot of consequences for end users who need to use their data back home, for example. There's also more positive signs on liberalization. The financial sector, for example, opening up to foreign companies in a way that was previously unthinkable. And other market openings look like they're making some progress. We're seeing talk of the car sector, for example, opening up. Some discussion around cloud services, although that, if we link it back to the data question, is going to be slightly more problematic to implement, I think. One final area that I would say to keep an eye out on is bankruptcies and how they're dealt with. There are a lot more bankruptcies going on in China these days than there used to be in the past. Whether that actually weeds out inefficient firms, whether that opens up opportunities for foreign companies to step in and act as white knights, things like that. These are areas that still remain to be proved, but they could be potentially quite interesting to watch. On the international side, despite the latest headlines in the press this morning, and with Donald Trump, you always have to watch what's actually happened overnight before you get on stage to talk about things. But I do still think that fundamentally it looks like a deal between the US and China is imminent and is going to happen. The easy bits of this deal are going to be around commodity trades, LNG, grains, China buying more. That's a very simple commitment. China had actually promised this in May last year, so it's been pretty obvious that it's the easy part of the deal. The harder bits will be around things like intellectual property protection, opening of sectors to FDI, and dealing with subsidies. As I mentioned, we've got slightly more optimistic signs on the first two of those areas than on subsidies, where it does look like the US government has essentially given up pushing China for that to be addressed as part of any final deal. Nevertheless, even though we do think a deal is likely, probably in June, although the timing is still subject to a lot of uncertainty, that is not going to alleviate all the tensions between the US and China. The fundamental issues that are going on in the background are really strategic rather than economic. And as a result of that, you will continue to see these issues come out again, and indeed many of them will probably survive a trade deal, not least the disputes over technology and those involving Huawei, for example. We also expect trade tensions to come back to the fore, particularly under the next administration. Bashing China is now an issue that has bilateral support within the US government between both the Democrats and the Republicans. So if there's something that the two parties can agree upon, you can probably think that they're going to go down that route. More broadly, and we heard this morning about the importance of the rules-based order for New Zealand, this is going to be an increasingly challenging time because we are moving from an era where even places like the US, in theory, adhered to a rules-based order, to one in which the great powers, and by that I mean particularly the US and China, are starting to act more and more like superpowers who are uncontained by global international norms, and they feel that they can just go their own route, and they're economically important enough to drag everybody along with them. I think the US is kind of leading the route on that, but behind the rhetoric that China has, under which it's still committed to globalization and the rules-based order, actually China is also behaving in that way. And we think that sort of going forward, as the confrontation between the two becomes more of a strategic issue, that trend is actually going to get worse, not better. And we've already seen its impact in things like the dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO, which is no longer really functioning effectively. However, there are more positive signs. Smaller economies that realize that they can't operate alone are starting to join together, sometimes under the leadership of bigger economies like Japan, for example. And this is really creating a sort of what I would call a third front of multilateralism that's designed to stand up to these two superpowers. The emblematic sort of sign of that is the CPTPP, which is a really huge achievement, and I think going forward is going to be very attractive to new members. We're already talking to a lot of governments who are actually very interested in joining. But also you're seeing it in things like the alternatives to the Belt and Road initiative that countries like India and Japan initially started promoting, and that actually it's the US that's a late joiner to this crowd with its latest Build Act. But in general, there is this pushback. I mentioned Belt and Road there and the pushback against it. Obviously, Belt and Road is still a very prominent initiative on the global stage. There have been some problems around delays to projects in places like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, of course. Even Pakistan actually now asking for a scaling down of several projects and a delay on those. And indeed, we're also seeing domestic Chinese companies, SOEs and banks, becoming a lot more cautious about Belt and Road projects, which has resulted in delays and slowdowns of many projects. However, I would say overall, I'm still a very big advocate for Belt and Road. There is a need for infrastructure financing. Chinese companies have tremendous competitive advantages in these areas. It's not just about the financing. And when you talk about things like the concerns around debt sustainability, actually these are often overblown. While yes, there are concerns around the pace at which debt is ramping up in some of these countries. Yes, there are some countries where they have taken on too much debt, but the idea that this is some sort of deliberate strategic trap on China's part is very oversold. And actually, if you look at their negotiation with countries that are experiencing debt problems, they tend to be very flexible on it. Moreover, we saw at the Second Belt and Road Summit in April that actually the Chinese government recognizes a lot of these problems and is keen to do a bit of a reboot. So we've seen these new guidelines on sustainable lending, on corruption, on the environment, and inclusivity. Now, dealing with these problems is going to be very challenging. It's not going to be a short-term issue, but I think it is important that the Chinese government has recognized these issues, and it is wanting to kind of address them in a more positive and productive fashion. The underlying story is very much still that other governments want China's money and Chinese investment, but they are keen for a better deal. On China's side, meanwhile, the political commitment to Belt and Road as part of Xi Jinping's agenda remains very, very strong indeed. I just wanted to kind of talk briefly about some of these sort of market areas. These charts are going to be too small, I think, for people to notice, to read, but really what it's showing is very much sort of the relationship between spending on key areas like household goods, on health, on food and beverage, and so on. And China is the sort of the reddish set of dots that you'll see towards the left-hand side of the screen. And the other dots are examples of other countries that have followed this development path, particularly in East Asia. And actually, what you see is that China is very much on a fairly normal path towards growth and consumption, and that actually it's very early on in that process. So the strong consumption growth story is one that we expect to continue for many, many years to come. This one hopefully a bit more visible. Looking at sort of the big cities and the expectations of the growth. This is looking at particularly the number of households that have incomes over 100,000 renminbi per year. That's about 22,400 New Zealand dollars and about two-thirds of New Zealand's current income per capita. So these are people with money to spend. They can afford foreign holidays. They can afford overseas education, perhaps with help with some relatives. They can afford, premium pet foods, imported foods, and so on. So these are people who are really sort of the key target market, and you can see the phenomenal growth that we expect to see between 2018 and 2023 in these big cities. And it's even more good news for a company sort of wanting to target that, because actually, even though these are sort of settled as individual cities, they're actually particularly in big clumps. So there's a clump around Shanghai that involves Shanghai, Suzhou, Hangzhou, Nanjing, so on. We were hearing earlier about the importance of the cultural differences within China, but actually these regions with these very wealthy households are actually, quite culturally coherent together in many instances. So the Shanghai one's an enormous one, and the Guangdong-based one is also one that's worth noting. I'm running a little short on time, so I'll move fairly fast through the sectoral examples. But one of the things I wanted to say was a couple of feedbacks from our team on the dairy sector within China. As one of my colleagues in Beijing attended an agricultural conference recently, one of the things that struck me and the feedback that they gave was actually their understanding of the tariff liberalization under the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement seemed to be somewhat poor. But actually, the messages, I think, chime very much with what we've been hearing elsewhere in terms of the quality issue remains a big concern for Chinese consumers, particularly for milk and infant formula. But actually, when it comes to other dairy products like yogurt and cheese, Chinese-made firms are doing much better and are, really overriding the competition from imports. Meanwhile, you are seeing Chinese brands beginning to go global. You've got Ely, who launched a big ice cream in Indonesia recently and bought Thailand's largest ice cream firm as well. You've seen Mengniu starting up factories in Indonesia, H&H selling formula in Australia, and even Shanxi goat milk apparently being now sold in ASEAN economies. So a lot of increased competition, I think, over the coming years for New Zealand dairy within the rest of the region. On tourism, I think the key things that I'd draw out from here are really that the prospects are very good. We expect over the next 5 years or so, the number of arrivals in New Zealand, if its market share of outbound travel remains consistent, to rise by about 50%, give or take. That's obviously a huge number. It's also much, much lower than New Zealand tourism is actually forecasting it at 800,000. But that may be no bad thing, given that actually a 48% increase in arrivals is going to cause its own set of stresses. But the key message is really that New Zealand has a great brand and that going forwards it's going to be an advantage for it in attracting tourists, particularly as Chinese consumers become more interested in experiences, dining, nature travel rather than just shopping. And finally, just looking at education, I think the key thing with education is really that it has been a great good news story for New Zealand and also for other countries that export to Chinese students. But going forwards, it's going to be a lot more problematic. On the one hand, there is this tension around migration policies, around immigration policies. There's still this sort of tensions within China itself over the actual, how does one put this, the national strategic sort of message that's being sent by the fact that a lot of Chinese students are moving overseas. That makes the government a bit more cautious about supporting this sort of trend. But fundamentally, within China, the demand for overseas education is still very strong. So as more people have these high incomes, you will still see growth. But we don't expect to see it growing at really quite the rates that it has done during the boom years of the past. Finally, to wrap things all up, I think it is important to say that sort of going forwards, China is going to remain New Zealand's biggest trade partner. That is going to be really an unchanged, and it's a good news story for New Zealand given that Chinese demand for New Zealand products is very strong and that these incomes are still rising. Having said that, there are a lot more risks emerging within the market. The debt story within China is an important one to watch in terms of the strategic risks. But also these politics issues are coming to the fore in a way that they have done previously. China's policies in Xinjiang, for example, are a growing concern for foreign companies that have engagement within China. And on the diplomatic level, the strains that are created by the detention of people like Michael Kovrig, this Canadian ex-diplomat who works for the International Crisis Group, are very problematic and do demand a different sort of international response. New Zealand, too, has an extradition agreement with the US. What is going to happen the next time the US asks New Zealand to extradite a high-level Chinese executive, perhaps, who's visiting the country? Meanwhile, we are seeing shifts in globalization. Obviously, there's big movements within global supply chains at the moment. A lot of people moving out of China because of rising costs, a process that's been really accelerated by the global trade war. But we're also seeing this differentiation between different standards within different countries, particularly when it comes to things like data. So I think from a country like New Zealand's perspective, there is a need to diversify. There is a need to work with allies to come up with solutions that work for New Zealand, both in terms of standards, but also in terms of trade agreements. But fundamentally, this economic relationship with China is not going away, and it will continue to grow, and it will continue to be a good news story for New Zealand businesses. Thank you very much.
So listen, Duncan, I think you had to skip over your last couple of slides quite quickly. As you probably gathered, I bought you a little bit of extra time. So if there's anything you'd like to finish up on before we go into Q&A, let's do that now.
I think there was a lot of sort of nitty-gritty details I could have given on some of those last two slides, but I'm happy to move to questions. I think it's always more interesting to have the discussion with the audience.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, you can raise your hands and we'll get a microphone to you, so that's one way. And the other way, of course, is you can submit your questions the way that you have during the day. Duncan, one of the things you spoke about was poverty reduction. And how is that going to change the client base that, say, New Zealand companies will be looking at as their markets over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think the interesting thing with poverty reduction is that obviously we're not talking about the sort of consumers who are going to be immediately moving on to buying Manuka honey or New Zealand lamb or something like that. What we are looking at that will be relevant, I think, for companies going forwards as part of this process is there's a lot of investment going into rural areas, rural infrastructure and things like that. But it is the sort of poverty reduction that we're talking at the moment is really around reaching the most remote parts of China. There's obviously been huge leaps and reductions in poverty in China over the last couple of decades, and we're down to the last few million people, which in Chinese terms is really, not a large percentage of the population, but to actually improve the life of those people in the poorest and most remote parts of China is hugely challenging.
You spoke of the settlement of the disagreement between China and the United States. Do you see that as being a good thing or a bad thing for New Zealand?
As they say, sort of, when elephants fight, it's bad for the grass, but also when elephants make love, it's bad for the grass. The overarching story, I think, is that it's probably a good news story because if China agrees to a trade deal with the US that involves things like IPR, that involves things like opening market access and things like that, my impression and our forecast is that actually this will not just be something that's going to be limited to the US, that eventually this is going to be something that spreads to improve access for all countries, that will improve regulatory standards for all companies. The caveat I would have on that is that actually our big issue around this sort of thing is actually it's the implementation of the agreement, and that yes, if you're operating in Shanghai or Beijing, then regulators will be aware of this, and these environments are already much easier to operate in than other parts of China. But when you look at other sort of more inland provinces, when you look at the second and third tier cities, actually in these areas the domestic side of things is likely to be much sort of higher on the agenda. So indigenous innovation, promoting local SOEs, protecting local interests. I think actually at the local level in these areas, its implementation is still going to be very challenging and patchy.
I'll be a little bit more specific, and if I can use one of our exports as an example. So I'm interested in knowing how quickly the China market might revert back to what it was. So if I take our timber exporters into China, a large amount of that was used at sort of mid-range furniture and exported into the United States. So thousands of furniture manufacturers went out of business, and many of the New Zealand exporters have had to find alternative markets for their timber at a lower yield. So how quickly do you think those manufacturers will reinstate themselves, or do you think they won't?
That's a very good question. My overarching thought would be that actually there will be comeback, there will be some recovery, but actually that it's not going to be a full recovery, and that in most instances of these firms that were very badly hit and shut down, either you've seen people moving production to safer locations, ASEAN, Vietnam, Indonesia, some cases Mexico, depending on what sort of products we're talking about, or you've actually just seen things shut down. And the availability of finance to restart things up is not what it used to be in the past. So the bounce back is actually going to be a lot tougher than I think some people are expecting.
I think so. Listen, you also spoke of something many of us would find hard to believe, political instability. How would you see that expressed?
I think that there's many different types of political instability in China. The first thing is that you can have the most enormous public protests that barely register on the national level, particularly around factory closures, failure to pay teachers. These things, they happen on a regular basis. There are thousands of them every year in China, and you would not even notice the vast majority of them because they get shut down very quickly. The issues are local, not national, and the government is actually very effective on making sure that the information remains contained and doesn't spread into a movement. The last time we saw anything like a movement spread was around strikes for workers' rights, and now we've seen the crackdown on the workers' movement, so that's very unlikely to happen again in the future. So I think there's a lot of that sort of instability rolling around. The other is really what I would call Zhongnanhai instability. And there is a constant tussle between different factions within government. It looks very much like Xi Jinping is the man in charge, and indeed, if you look through the sort of the senior ranks of provincial leaders, of heads of the regulatory organs and so on, it's pretty clear that he dominates the government in a way that nobody has since probably since Mao, actually, even more than Deng, I would say. But at the same time, everyone is very sensitive to any indication that actually there might be a bubbling of discontent. So we have seen things like people producing editorials that criticize the government either directly or indirectly. And you can attack sort of policies, particularly before they've actually kind of reached a sort of a final stage of implementation. But it's interesting to me that they seem to be doing it much more directly over the last year or so than I've seen certainly for 5 or 6 years, and that the government seems to have responded to that by becoming a little bit more flexible.
Let's go to some of the questions from our audience. The Prime Minister's gone, so I can ask you this very quietly. What's your take on how important the PM's visit to China really was?
I think the important thing was that it happened. And the fact that we've actually seen kind of her meet with Xi Jinping, which she didn't have to. Technically, if he could have just stayed back and said, it's a prime minister, you should meet with Li Keqiang, and that's good enough. The fact that actually she was able to meet with the president, it really sort of signals that, New Zealand is not on the naughty step. And let's face it, there are an awful lot of countries who are on the naughty step at the moment. So the fact that meeting happened is really a signal to people involved in the state sector, to business people, that actually, yes, New Zealand is okay. You can kind of go ahead with stuff on that front. So that signaling is very important. Obviously, we've heard quite a lot today from various people here how important it is to keep up that engagement. I think that's a different type of importance. That one's actually kind of delivering progress for actual deals and things like this, whereas the visit is more about sort of giving a sort of a tick to New Zealand to you can do business with this country.
There's a question here I think relates to the US-China trade wars. Somebody's moving the questions. Third question down. So the US-China trade war and US administration's scrutiny on Chinese investments. So is a movement of investment initially in the US possible towards New Zealand in some specific niche sectors?
Oh, goodness. If New Zealand tech firms are willing to sell to China, then yes. I mean, really, Chinese firms are very keen to buy IP in any sector that can be taken back home and used to move China up the value chain. Basically the only constraint on this at the moment is around government's willingness to let it happen. The US is essentially now a closed door to Chinese high-tech investment. Indeed, on the education side, they're even sort of restricting student visits and other sorts of academic interaction on high-tech areas. So yes, that opens up opportunities, but there's also, you do have to realize there's a reason why the US is doing this. And it's not just around keeping that strategic height, it's also that actually, the stuff that goes back to China creates tomorrow's competition.
Another question from our most popular questionnaire today, Anonymous. Can you describe the increasing economic engagement with Africa and China's position in the largest economy in BRICS? Is this something that New Zealand can learn from?
Yeah, I mean, Africa's an interesting one. I'm not sure China's engagement in Africa is kind of something that has huge relevance for New Zealand. No. It's still commodity driven overall. It's generating quite a lot of tensions in terms of the Chinese sort of presence in the retail sector in Africa is kind of becoming increasingly apparent and generating a lot of ethnic tension as a result. But overall, China has been a driver for economic growth in Africa, as it has been in New Zealand. So that's probably the closest one there. On the BRICS side, the combination of the BRICS is a bit problematic. They don't really fit together terribly well. There is a BRICS initiative that China's engaged in and leading. That's most interesting for the way that actually China is not dominating that group in the way that it is, for example, the AIIB, and that actually it's kind of, to me, a bit of a sort of a learning zone for ways in which China can kind of engage in multilateral lending activities that don't necessarily come with a very clear sort of, China national interest stamp on it.
I'm going to combine a question that I had, and I have to say you didn't sound as confident on the BRI. There seemed more caution in your voice versus that of our politicians this morning. And there's a question here that says, why is China pivoting away from just promoting infrastructure spending under the BRI and now moving toward enhancing its institutional underpinnings?
I think there's a very, very clear reason on this side, and that's basically that they've realized that actually they've exposed themselves to really quite a lot of debt. A lot of Chinese banks act as... I think the important thing to realize with BRI is that certainly up until, say a year ago or so, it was less a centrally driven initiative than an initiative in which the interests of a lot of Chinese SOEs who wanted to do business overseas were married with Chinese banks that actually kind of had this sort of imprimatur from on top that like lending for this is okay, so we can just shovel out the money on it. But actually they're now realizing that actually a lot of these projects are not going to deliver the returns that were suggested in the first place. They're also causing national strategic pushback at the top. So China's becoming a lot more cautious about trying to make sure it does it better. But yeah, I mean, it's still moving forwards. It's still doing good stuff in many parts of the world. You can see Chinese infrastructure in places like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Indonesia. Like this sort of infrastructure investment is helping to keep down inflation in these countries by reducing the sort of bottlenecks that used to emerge when growth sort of reached a certain level. That is a very positive role for Asia's development.
And I think the next question is probably similarly related. It says, Bank of China has just indicated that it may tighten its monetary policies. Should it raise some concerns on China's current financial situation?
Short answer is yes. The central bank is very concerned about the debt problem. There is a bit of a tussle between the central bank and other agencies within government who would like to see growth issues prioritized and various other things like moving up the value chain prioritized. But for the central bank, for some years now, that issue of how to rein in the credit growth story has been the dominating feature of Chinese monetary policy. So you can see that they want to slow down the rate of credit growth. They're also aware that at a certain point, they need to kind of like relax again to let the economy kind of recover. It is important to note that actually China is not deleveraging. It is merely leveraging up at a slightly slower pace than before, but it is very much a stop-start process, and actually getting that leverage down rather than slower is actually a huge challenge that I don't think China's yet ready for. It would need much more progress on productivity improvement domestically.
And when you started your presentation, you talked about the stimulus that's being used in the economy at the moment. Is that totally government spend on infrastructure, or is there other stimulus that's coming through at the moment?
The government spend on infrastructure is probably the key element of it. There has been a slight easing of monetary policy. You've seen interest rates coming down from around the market interest rate came down from around the middle of last year. But it's relatively marginal in terms of the credit relaxation. And as I say, they're keen not to let that become the dominant driver again.
Okay. Any questions out here before we close? I think next we've got afternoon tea, so you can get that cup of coffee in and last the balance of the afternoon. So I've got one question down here. We'll take that as our final one. Thank you.
Hello. Hi there, Duncan. Robert from Air New Zealand. Just a quick question. You did mention this perhaps recalibrating the rollout of the BRI. Would you see this as a reaction to perhaps initiatives like the CPTPP, and also in conjunction with its rollout, I think there's a geostrategic element that for Australia and New Zealand, should that be a cause for concern, or do you think perhaps an opportunity for both countries?
It's going to put me on the spot with the last one. I think the calibration of BRI, I think the CPTPP hasn't been the main driver of that. Certainly there are things that are competing with Belt and Road much more directly than CPTPP is, like the US Build Act, which has now doubled the amount of financing that the US can push into development financing, like Australia's big increase in Pacific funding. I think New Zealand is also spending a bit more on that side. Like India and Japan's Africa investment plans. So I think the fact that there are now all of these competing alternatives makes people much more aware that actually, if we get into a strategic game, then basically it's just going to be these other places we're investing that are just going to play us off against each other and get the best deal. It's a great time to be investing as an emerging market. But on Pacific investment in the BRI and the aspects around that, I think it would be naive to think that there aren't security aspects. I think sometimes those can be overblown. The sort of string of pearls idea that they had in South Asia is hugely overblown. These ports are not being, frankly, built for defense naval vessels, and I think the idea that actually governments can't simply step in and just nationalize stuff if it became that strategically tense is also, you know, a bit naive. The fact that you've built a port and that you're running a port is more of an advantage for everybody to engage with that country via the port or whatever the other form of infrastructure is than it is a strategic defense environment. Now, if you're talking about military bases like Djibouti, that's a whole separate story. But when it comes to kind of building infrastructure, I think by and large, a lot of the hard infrastructure is a good thing, and national securities can be overplayed.
So, ladies and gentlemen, another fine presentation, and certainly on behalf of the audience here, can I also ask you to thank Asia New Zealand Foundation for assisting Duncan be here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in thanking Duncan.
Thanks very much.